Chapter 1. We decide to go on holiday. There were 4 of us, George, and William Samuel Harris, and myself, and Montmorency. We were sitting in my room, and we were smoking, and talking about how bad we were. Ill, I mean, of course. We were all feeling in poor health, and we were getting quite worried about it. Harris said that he felt really bad sometimes, and he did not know what he was doing. And then George said that he felt bad too, and that he did not know what he was doing either. With me, it was my heart. I knew it was my heart because I had read something in a magazine about the symptoms of a bad heart. I had all of them. It is a most extraordinary thing, but every time I read about an illness, I realize that I have it too, and that my symptoms are very bad. In fact, my health has always been a worry. I remember one day I had a little health problem, and I went to the British Museum library to read about it. I took the book off the library shelf and I began to read. After some time, I turned over the page and I began to read about another illness. I don't remember the name of the illness, but I know it was something really terrible. I read about half a page, and then I knew that I had that disease too. I sat there for a time, cold with horror. Slowly, I began to turn over more pages. I came to a disease which was worse than the last one. I began to read about it, and as I expected, I had that disease too. Then I began to get really interested in myself, so I went back to the beginning of the book. I started with the letter A, and I read from A to Z. I found that there was only one disease which I did not have. This made me a little unhappy. Why didn't I have that disease too? When I walked into that reading room, I was a happy, healthy young man. When I left, I was a very sick man, close to death. But I was talking about my heart. Nobody understood how ill I really was. I had this bad heart when I was a boy. It was with me all the time. I knew that it was my heart because I had all the symptoms of a bad heart. The main symptom was that I did not want to work. Of course, nobody understood that the problem was my heart. Doctors were not so clever then. They just thought that I was lazy. "Why, you lazy boy, you," they used to say. "Get up and do some work for once in your life." They did not understand that I was ill. And they did not give me medicine for this illness. They hit me on the side of the head. It is very strange, but those blows on my head often made the illness go away for a time. Sometimes just one blow made the sickness disappear and made me want to start work immediately. Anyway, that evening, George and William Harris and I sat there for half an hour and described our illnesses to each other. I explained to George and William Harris how I felt when I got up in the morning. William Harris told us how he felt when he went to bed. Then George stood in front of the fire, and with great feeling, he showed us how he felt in the night. George always thinks he is ill, but really there is never anything the matter with him, you know. At that moment, Mrs. Poppets, my housekeeper, knocked on the door. She wanted to know if we were ready to have supper. We smiled sadly at each other, and then we said that perhaps we should try to eat something. Harris said that a little food helped to prevent illness. So Mrs. Poppets brought the supper in. We sat down at the table, and for half an hour we managed to play with some steak and chips, and with a large cake that Mrs. Poppets had made. When we had made ourselves eat something, we filled our glasses and we lit our pipes. Then we began to talk about our health again. We were not quite sure what was the matter with us. However, we were all quite certain of one thing. We had been doing too much work. "We need a rest," Harris said. "A rest and a change," George added. I agreed with George, and I said that perhaps we could go to the country. We could find a nice, quiet place, and we could sit in the warm summer sun. We could go somewhere peaceful, far away from other people. Harris said that he thought that would be awful. He added that he had been to a place like that once. Everyone went to bed at 8 o'clock, and he had to walk for an hour to buy cigarettes and a newspaper. "No," Harris said. "If you want a rest and a change, then the sea is best." I said that this was a terrible idea. A sea trip is fine if you are going for a month or two, but not for a week. I know what it is like. You start out on Monday, and you think that you are going to enjoy yourself. You wave goodbye happily to your friends. You walk up and down on the ship like Captain Cook, Sir Francis Drake, or Christopher Columbus. On Tuesday, you wish that you had not come. On Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, you wish that you were dead. On Saturday, you are able to drink something. You begin to smile a little at the kind people who ask you how you are. On Sunday, you start to walk again, and you eat a little. And on Monday morning, as you stand and wait to get off the ship, you begin to enjoy yourself. I remember that a friend of mine once took a short sea trip from London to Liverpool for his health. He bought a return ticket, but when he got to Liverpool, he sold it, and he came back by train. So I was against the sea trip. Not for myself, you understand. I am never seasick. But I was afraid for George. George said he would be fine. In fact, he said he would quite like it, but he thought that Harris and I would both be ill. Harris said he was never seasick. In fact, he had often tried to be ill, but he had not succeeded. It is very strange, but when you are on land, you never meet anybody who has ever been seasick. So George said, "Well, let's go up the river then." He added, "We'll have fresh air on the river. The hard work on the boat will make us hungry, so we'll enjoy our food. We'll sleep well too." Harris replied, "Well, you never have any trouble sleeping anyway. In fact, you're always going to sleep." But in the end, Harris agreed that it was a good idea. I thought that it was a good idea too. The only one who did not like the idea was Montmorency. "It's different for me," his face said. "You like it, but I don't. There's nothing for me to do. I don't smoke. I don't like looking at the trees and the flowers. And when I'm asleep, you'll play about with the boat and I'll fall over the side." Montmorency's idea of a good time is to collect together all the most awful dogs he can find, and then go round the town looking for other awful dogs to fight. But we were 3-1, so we decided to go anyway. Chapter 2. We start to make plans. We pulled out the maps and we discussed plans. We decided to start on the following Saturday. Harris and I would go down to Kingston in the morning and take the boat up to Chertsey. But George could not leave the city until the afternoon. George goes to sleep at a bank from 10 o'clock until 4 o'clock from Monday to Friday. On Saturday, they wake him up and put him out onto the street at 2 o'clock. So George was going to meet us at Chertsey. The next question was where to sleep at night. George and I did not want to sleep in hotels at night. We wanted to sleep outside. How beautiful, we said, in the country, by the river, with the birds, the flowers, and the trees all around us. I can imagine it easily. At the end of the day, night comes and the world is peaceful and calm. Our little boat moves silently into some quiet little corner on the river. There we put up our tent and we cook and eat our simple supper. Then we fill our pipes and we sit and talk quietly. Sometimes we stop for a moment or two and we listen to the water as it plays gently against the boat. The silver moon shines down on us, and our heads are full of beautiful thoughts. We sit in silence for a time. We do not want to speak. Then we laugh quietly, put away our pipes, say good night, and go to bed. The peaceful sound of the water against the boat sends us to sleep, and we dream. We dream that the world is young again. "And what about when it rains?" Harris said. He was right. When it rains, you do not enjoy living in tents. I thought about it again. It is evening. You are very wet. There is a lot of water in the boat, and everything in it is wet too. You find a place on the river bank which is not as wet as other places. You get out of the boat, pull out the tent, and two of you try to put it up. Because it is wet, it is very heavy, and then it falls on top of you. You cannot get it off your head, and you get angry. All the time it is raining heavily. It is difficult to put up a tent in good weather. In wet weather it is almost impossible. The other man does not help you. He starts to play about. You get your side of the tent up and begin to tie the ropes to the ground. Just then, he pulls the tent from his side and he destroys all your hard work. "Here! What do you think you're doing?" you call out. "What are you doing, you mean?" he answers angrily. "Don't pull it! You've got it all wrong, you stupid man!" you cry. "No, I haven't!" he shouts. "Let your side go!" "I tell you, you're wrong!" you scream, and you wish you could get to him to hit him. You pull your side of the tent hard and pull out all the ropes on his side. "Ah, the stupid fool!" you hear him say to himself. And then, suddenly, he gives a violent pull, and your side comes out too. Slowly, you start to go round to his side to tell him what you think of him. At the same time, he begins to come round the other way to tell you what he feels. And you follow each other round and round, and you shout at each other until the tent falls down. And there you are. You stand and look at each other across the tent. At the same time, you both call out, "There you are! What did I tell you?" Meanwhile, the third man has been trying to get the water out of the boat. The water has run up his arms, and he is wet and angry. Suddenly, he wants to know what you are doing, and why the tent is not up yet. When, at last, the tent is up, you carry the things out of the boat. Supper is mostly rainwater. Rainwater bread, rainwater soup. Happily, you have something strong to drink. This brings back your interest in life until it is time to go to bed. There you dream that a very large animal has suddenly sat down on you. You wake up, and you understand that something terrible has happened. At first, you think that the world has ended. Then you think that this cannot be true. So it must be thieves, or murderers, or fire. No help comes, and all you know is that thousands of people are kicking you, and you cannot breathe. Somebody else is in trouble too. You can hear his cries. They are coming from under your bed. You decide to fight, and you hit out left and right with your arms and your legs. You are shouting all the time. At last, you find your head in the fresh air. Near you, you see a half-dressed murderer. He is waiting to kill you. You are just going to start fighting him when you see that it is Jim. At the same moment, he sees that it is you. "Oh, it's you, is it?" he says. "Yes," you answer. "What's happened?" "The tent has blown down, I think," he says. "Where's Bill?" Then you both shout for Bill. The ground underneath you moves, and a voice says, "Get off my head!" The next day, you have no voices because you have all caught colds. And all day you argue with each other in angry whispers. We therefore decided that we would sleep out in tents on fine nights and in hotels when it rained. Montmorency was very pleased about this. He does not like peace and quiet. He prefers noise. But he looks so good, so well behaved. When old ladies and gentlemen look at him, tears come into their eyes. When he first came to live with me, I thought, "This dog will not be with me long. He is too good for this world." But by the end of the year, he had killed 12 chickens, which I had to pay for. I had pulled him out of 114 street fights. A woman had brought me a dead cat and had called me a murderer. Then I changed my ideas about Montmorency. We had decided where to sleep, so now we had to discuss what to take with us. We began to argue about this, so we agreed that we had done enough for one night. Chapter 3. We decide what to take. The following evening, we discussed what we wanted to take with us. Harris said, "Now, get me a piece of paper, Jay, and write everything down. George, you get a pencil, and I'll make the list." That's Harris. He tells everybody what to do, and they do all the work. I remember that my Uncle Podger was like Harris. Everybody in the house had to help when Uncle Podger did a job. When they bought a picture once, Aunt Podger asked, "Now, where shall we put this?" "Oh, I'll do it. Don't worry about it. I'll do it all myself," he said. And then he took off his coat to begin. He sent one of the girls out to buy some nails, and then he sent one of the boys to tell her how big the nails ought to be. "Now, Bill, you go and get my hammer," he shouted, "and bring me a ruler, Tom. And Jim, I need a ladder. And a kitchen chair, too. Maria, you stay here to hold the light. And Tom, come here. You can give me the picture." Then he lifted the picture up, and he dropped it. He tried to catch the glass, and he cut himself. He looked for something to put round his finger, and he could not find anything. So he danced round the house, and he shouted at everybody. Half an hour later, the finger had been tied up, they had bought new glass, and everything was ready. Uncle Podger tried again. Everybody stood round him. They were all ready to help. 2 people held the chair, a third helped him to get on it, a fourth gave him a nail, and a fifth passed him the hammer. He took the nail, and he dropped it. "There," he said sadly, "now the nail's gone." So everybody got down on the ground to look for it. At last we found the nail, but then he lost the hammer. "Where's the hammer? What did I do with the hammer? There are 7 of you there, and you don't know where the hammer is?" We found the hammer for him. But then he lost the place on the wall where he was going to put the picture. So each one of us had to get up on the chair and look for the place. And each one of us thought that it was a different place. Then Uncle Podger tried again himself. This time he fell off the chair onto the piano. His head and his body hit the piano at the same time. The music was beautiful, but Uncle Podger's words were not. Aunt Maria was not pleased. She said that she did not want the children to listen to those terrible words. She added calmly, "The next time that you are going to put a picture on the wall, please tell me. Then I can arrange to go and spend a week with my mother." Uncle Podger got up and tried again. And at midnight, the picture was on the wall. It was not very straight, and everyone was very tired and unhappy. Uncle Podger looked at the picture proudly and said, "You see, it was only a little job." Harris is like that. So I told him that George would write down the list, and I would do the work. He could get the pencil and the paper. The first list was too long, so we started again. "Now," George said, "we don't want to take a tent. We can put a cover over the boat at night. It will be like a little house, lovely and warm and comfortable. It's much easier than a tent." Then we made a list of all the clothes we needed. George told us that he knew all about this kind of thing, and we believed him. We discovered later that this was not true. Next, we talked about the food. "First, breakfast," George began. "We need eggs, cold meat, tea, bread and butter, of course. And for dinner, we can take cold chicken legs, tomatoes, cold meat, fruit, cakes, chocolate. We can drink water." Then he added, "And we can take a bottle of whiskey too. For when we are sick, you know. We did not wish to talk about being sick, but later we were glad we had taken the whiskey. So we made our list, and it was a long one. Chapter 4. We pack. The next day, which was Friday, we collected all these things together. In the evening, we met to pack. We got a big suitcase for the clothes. There were 2 large baskets with lids for the food and for the pans and things to cook with. We moved the table over to the window. Then we put everything in the middle of the floor. After we had done that, we sat there and we looked at it. I said that I would pack. I think that I am very good at packing. It is one of the things that I do best. So I told the others that I would organize it. They agreed to this idea too quickly. That was rather strange. George lit his pipe and sat back in the armchair. Harris put his feet on the table and lit a cigarette. This was not, of course, what I had expected. When I said that I would organize it, I meant that I would tell them what to do. Then I would sit and watch them do it. However, I said nothing, and I started to pack the clothes. It took much longer than I had expected, but in the end it was finished. I sat on the suitcase and closed it. George and Harris watched me with great interest. You going to put the boots in?" Harris asked. I looked round and saw the boots. Why did Harris wait until I had closed the suitcase? George laughed quietly. I opened the suitcase and I put the boots in. It was not easy. And just as I was going to close the suitcase again, an awful idea came to me. Had I packed my toothbrush? Of course, I had to look for it, and of course I could not find it. I had to take everything out again. I found George's toothbrush. I found Harris's toothbrush, but I could not find mine. In the end, I found it inside a boot. I packed everything again. When I had finished, George asked if the soap was in the suitcase. I said I did not care about the soap. I threw down the lid of the suitcase and I closed it again. Then I found my cigarettes were inside it. I finished the suitcase at 10:05, and the food was still not packed. Harris said, "We have to start the holiday in 12 hours. Perhaps George and I had better do the rest of the packing." I agreed, and I sat down. They began quite happily. I said nothing. I only waited. I looked at all the plates and cups and bottles and tomatoes and cakes, etc. I felt that it was soon going to get exciting. It did. They started by breaking a cup. That was just to show you what they could do and to get you interested. Then Harris packed a pan on top of a tomato, and, well, they had to pick out the tomato with a teaspoon. And then it was George's turn, and he stepped on the butter. I did not say anything, but I got up and went over to the table and watched them. This annoyed them more than anything, and it made them worried and excited. They stepped on things, and they put things behind them, and then they could not find them when they wanted them. They packed soft things at the bottom of the basket, and then put heavy things on top of them. Then it got worse. After George got the butter off his shoe, they tried to put it in the teapot. At first, they could not get it in. Then, when they did get it in, they decided that the teapot was the wrong place. But they could not get the butter out again. However, In the end, they did manage to get it out, and they put it down on a chair. Harris sat on it, and when he stood up, the butter stuck to his trousers. Then they looked for the butter all over the room. In the end, George got behind Harris and he saw it. "There it is!" he cried. "Where?" Harris asked, and he turned round quickly. "Stand still!" George shouted. When they got the butter off Harris, they packed it in the teapot again. Montmorency was in all this, of course. He sat down on things just when George and Harris were going to pack them. He put his leg into the sugar. He ran away with the teaspoons. He pretended that the oranges were rats, and he got into the food basket and killed 3 of them. The packing was completed at 1:50 in the morning, and we all went to bed. George said, "What time shall I wake you to?" Harris said, 7. I said 6. In the end, we said, "Wake us at 6:30, George." Chapter 5. We start our holiday. It was Mrs. Poppets who woke me the next morning. She said, "Do you know that it's nearly 9 o'clock, sir?" "What?" I cried, and I jumped out of bed. I woke Harris and told him. He said, "I thought you told us to get up at 6. "I did," I answered. "Well, why didn't you wake me then?" he asked. "Now we won't be on the water until after 12 o'clock. Then we remembered. We looked at George. He was still asleep. Now, it makes me very angry when I see another man asleep and I am awake. We decided to wake George. We ran across the room and we pulled the bedclothes off him. Harris hit him with a shoe, and I shouted in his ear. He woke up. "What?" he began. "Get up, you fat, lazy thing!" Harris shouted. "It's 9:45. Then we began to get ready, and we remembered that we had packed the toothbrushes. So we had to go downstairs to get them out of the suitcase. Finally, we were ready, and Harris said, "We need a good breakfast inside us today." While we were eating, George got the newspaper and read us interesting pieces from it. Pieces about people who had been killed on the river, and interesting reports about the weather. The weather report for that day said, rain, cold, wet to fine, some thunder, and an east wind. But weather reports make me angry anyway. They always tell you what the weather was like yesterday or the day before. It is never today's weather. It is always wrong. I remember that one autumn I went on holiday. On that holiday, the weather reports in the newspaper were always wrong. On Monday it said, heavy rain with thunder, so we did not go out that day. All day people passed our house. They were all going out, happy and smiling. The sun was shining, and there were no clouds in the sky. "Ah," we said as we watched them, "they'll be very wet when they come back, though." And we laughed. Then we sat down by the fire and read our books. At 12 o'clock the room was too hot, and the sun was still shining. "Well, it will rain this afternoon then," we told ourselves. The rain never came. The next morning we read that it was going to be sunny and very hot. So we dressed in light clothes and we went out. Half an hour later it began to rain hard and a very cold wind blew up. and this went on all day. We came home with colds, and we went to bed. But on the morning of our holiday, it was bright and sunny, and George could not make us unhappy. So he went to work. Harris and I finished the rest of the breakfast. Then we carried all our luggage into the road. We tried to get a taxi. Usually, taxis come along every 3 minutes. In fact, there are usually too many taxis. However, that morning we waited 20 minutes for a taxi. A crowd of interested people collected to watch us. I think it was because we had so much luggage. There was a big suitcase, a small bag, 2 baskets, several blankets, some fruit in a brown paper bag, some pans, some umbrellas, and 4 or 5 coats and raincoats. After a very long time, a taxi arrived and stopped for us. We packed our things into it, kicked 2 of Montmorency's friends out of the taxi, and started on our holiday. The crowd of people waved goodbye to us. Chapter 6. On the River. At Kingston, our boat was waiting for us. Harris and I put all our things into it, and we moved off along the River Thames. Montmorency was at the front of the boat. We travelled along the river without any accidents. Well, there was only one little accident. That was when the boat hit the river bank, and Harris fell over backwards. When we came to Hampton Court Palace, Harris asked me if I had ever been in the maze there. He told me a story about it. He went into the maze once to show a friend the way. He had studied a map of the maze, and so he knew it was very easy to get out of it again. Harris said to his friend, "We'll just go in and walk around for 10 minutes, and then we'll come out and get some lunch. It's easy, you see. You just keep taking the first turning to the right." Soon after they had gone in, they met some people. These people said that they had been there for 3/4 of an hour. They said they wanted to get out. Harris said, "Follow me. I'm going out myself in about 10 minutes. The people all said that Harris was very kind, and they began to follow him. As they were going along, they collected other people who wanted to get out. In the end, all the people in the maze were following Harris. There were about 20 of them. Some of them had thought that they were never going to see their friends and their families again. One woman was carrying a baby. She held on to Harris's arm because she did not want to lose him. Harris continued to turn to the right, but it seemed to be a long way. At last, Harris's friend said to him, "This must be a very big maze." "One of the biggest in Europe," Harris answered. "Yes, it must be," his friend continued, "because we've walked about 3 kilometers already." Harris began to think that it was rather strange, but he went on. After some time, they came to a piece of cake on the ground. Harris's friend said that they had passed the piece of cake earlier. Harris replied, "No, impossible." The woman with the baby said, "No, I took it from the baby, and I threw it there myself. It was just before we met you. In fact, I wish I never had met you," she added. Harris got angry then, and he took out his map. He showed it to the people, but one man said, "A map's no good when you don't know where you are." So then Harris said that the best thing was to go back to the entrance and start again. Everybody agreed, and they all turned and followed Harris the other way. After 10 minutes, they found themselves in the centre of the maze. Harris was going to pretend that he wanted to be in the centre, but the crowd looked dangerous, so Harris decided to say that it was an accident. Anyway, now they knew where they were on the map, and it looked easy. So they all started off again for the third time. And 3 minutes later, they were back in the centre again. After that, every time they tried again, they arrived back in the centre. Harris took out his map again, but this made the crowd angry. They told him what to do with his map. Harris felt that the crowd was not very grateful to him. Then they all started to shout, and in the end the keeper came. He climbed up a ladder, and he called to them, "Wait there! I'll come and get you!" But he was a young keeper, and he was new to the job, so when he got into the maze, he could not find them. Then he got lost. From time to time, they saw him as he ran past on the other side of the hedge. He shouted, "Wait there! I'm coming!" Then, 5 minutes later, he appeared again in the same place. He asked them why they had moved. They had to wait for one of the old keepers to come back from lunch and let them out. Harris said that it was a fine maze, and we agreed that we would try to get George into it on the way back. Chapter 7. Harris Gets Angry. Harris told me about the maze as we were passing through Molesey Lock. Our boat was the only one in the lock that day. Usually it is very busy. On Sundays, when the weather is fine, there are boats everywhere. Everybody comes down to the river. They wear brightly coloured clothes, and the river is full of colour. Yellow, and blue, and orange, and green, and white, and red, and pink. At Hampton, Harris wanted to get out and have a look at the church there, but I refused to stop. I have never liked visiting churches, but Harris loves them. He said, "I've looked forward to visiting Hampton Church ever since we decided to make this trip." He added, "I only came on the trip because I thought we were going there." I reminded him about George. I said, "We've got to get the boat up to Shepperton by 5 o'clock to meet him." Then Harris got angry with George. "Why does George have to play around all day? Why has he left us with this big, heavy boat to tow up and down the river? Why couldn't George come and do some work? Why didn't he take a day's holiday and come down with us? The bank! Ha! What good is he at the bank?" He stopped for a moment, and then he continued. "I never see him doing any work there. He sits behind a bit of glass all day, and he pretends to do something." "What's the good of a man behind a bit of glass? I have to work. Why can't George work? What does he do at the bank? What good are banks anyway? They take all your money, and then when you write out a cheque, they send it back. They say you've spent all your money. What's the good of that? If George was here, we could go to see that church. Anyway, I don't believe he's at the bank. He's playing about somewhere. That's what he's doing, and we've got to do all the work. I'm going to get out and have a drink." I told him that there were no pubs nearby, and then he started shouting about the river. "What good is the river? We'll all die of thirst. No pubs!" It's better to let Harris go on shouting when he gets angry. Then he gets tired, and he's quiet afterwards. I reminded him that we had water in the boat. Then he started shouting about water. He said drinks like that made people ill. However, he said that he must drink something. He climbed onto the seat, and he bent down to get the bottle out of the basket. It was at the bottom, and he had to bend down lower and lower. At the same time, he was trying to steer the boat, and he pulled the wrong rope. The boat turned sharply and bumped into the bank of the river, and Harris fell into the basket. He stood there on his head, and he held on to the side of the boat. His legs were in the air. He could not move in case he fell over. He had to stay there until I could catch his legs and pull him back, and that made him more angry. We stopped under the trees by Kempton Park, and we had lunch. It is very pretty there, on the grass by the river, under the trees. We had an excellent meal, and Harris calmed down and began to enjoy himself again. By 3:30, we had reached Sunbury Lock. Then we went up to Waltham, which is quite an interesting place. Julius Caesar stayed there with his soldiers. Queen Elizabeth I, she was there too. You can never get away from that woman. She was everywhere. Next we came to Halliford and Shepperton. There is an old church at Shepperton, and I was worried in case Harris wanted to go and visit it. I saw him looking towards it as we came near, but I moved the boat quickly, and Harris's cap fell into the water. We had to get it back, of course. Luckily, he was very angry with me, and so he forgot about his church. As we came up to the lock at Weybridge, we saw something brightly coloured on one of the lock gates. When we looked closer, we saw that it was George. Montmorency started to bark madly. I shouted, and Harris called out wildly. George waved his cap and yelled back to us. The lock-keeper ran out because he thought someone had fallen in the water. He seemed annoyed when he saw that no one had fallen in. Chapter 8. George starts work. We decided that now George was there, he was going to do some work. He did not want to work, of course. "I've had a bad day at the bank," he explained. Harris, who is sometimes a little cruel, said, "Ah, and now you're going to have a bad time on the river for a change. A change is good for you. Come on, get out of the boat and tow." George could not refuse, really, but he did say, "Perhaps it would be better if I stayed in the boat and prepared the meal. You two can tow the boat." Then he added, "It's very difficult to prepare a meal, and you both look tired." Our only reply was to give him the rope. So he started walking, and he pulled the boat behind him. Sometimes people forget that they are towing a boat, and later George told us a story about this. George had once seen a man and a young lady who were walking by the side of the river. They were pulling a rope behind them, and they were talking to each other. They did not notice that there was no boat on the end of the rope. Of course, they probably had a boat on the end of the rope when they started out, but it had disappeared. The two young people were not worried about this. They had their rope. They did not seem to care that there was no boat. George was going to call out to tell them about it. But just then he had an idea. He took hold of the rope, and he tied it to his own boat. Then he and his 3 fat, heavy friends sat in the back of their boat and lit their pipes. And that young man and young woman towed George and his friends up to Marlow. It was when they reached the lock that they looked back. Suddenly they understood that they had been towing the wrong boat. George said, "I've never seen anyone look as sad as those two young people then." The young man was a bit annoyed. In fact, he was probably going to say something angry to George and his friends. But just then, the young woman cried wildly, "Oh, Henry, then where's Aunt Mary?" "Did they ever get the old lady back?" Harris asked. George replied that he did not know. But the most exciting thing of all is to let girls tow your boat. Let me tell you about it. First of all, you need 3 girls. You always need 3 girls to tow a boat. 2 of them hold the rope, and the other one runs here and there and laughs all the time. They usually begin by tying themselves up in the rope. They get it round their legs, and then they have to sit down to untie it. Next they get it round their necks. When they finally get it right, they always start by running. They pull the boat much too fast. After a few minutes, they are tired, and so they stop suddenly. They all sit down on the grass and they start to laugh. Meanwhile, your boat goes out into the middle of the river and it starts to turn round. Then they stand up and are surprised. "Oh, look," they say, "the boat's gone into the middle of the river." After this, they pull you along quite well for a time. Then one of them decides to stop for something else. So the boat runs aground in shallow water near the river bank. You jump up, and you push the boat off into deep water. You shout to them, "Don't stop!" "Yes, what's the matter?" they shout back. "Don't stop!" you cry loudly. "Don't what?" "Don't stop! Go on! Go on!" "Go back, Emily, and see what they want," one of them says. And Emily comes back and asks, "What is it? Is anything wrong?" "No," you shout. "It's all right, but go on. Don't stop." "Why not?" "Because we can't steer the boat if you stop." "Why not?" "You must keep the boat moving." "Oh, all right. I'll tell them. Are we doing everything else all right?" "Oh, yes, very nicely, but don't stop." "I see. Oh, give me my hat, please. It's over there." You find her hat, and you give it to her. But then another girl comes. She thinks she will have her hat too. And then they take Mary's hat for her. Mary does not want it, so they bring it back. Then they want a comb. It is about 20 minutes before they start again. Then at the next corner, they see a cow. You have to stop and leave the boat to chase the cow away. Anyway, this time it was George who towed us on to Penton Hook. There we discussed the important question of where to spend the night. We had decided to sleep on the boat. Therefore, we could stay there, or we could go on past Staines. In the end, we decided to continue to Runnymede. Later, we all wished we had stopped at Penton Hook. Chapter 9. Our first night on the boat. After some time, Harris and I began to think that Bell Weir Lock had disappeared. "Perhaps someone has taken it away," we said. George had towed the boat as far as Staines, and we had towed it from there. It seemed to get heavier and heavier. We began to think that we were right and that someone had moved the lock. But finally, at 7:30, we reached it and got through it. By now, we just wanted to eat and to go to bed. So we stopped before we reached Magna Carta Island. It was quite a pretty place, and we tied our boat to a big tree. We were looking forward to having something to eat then, but George said, "No, it's better to put the cover on the boat first, before it gets too dark. All our work will be finished then. We'll be able to sit down and enjoy our meal." None of us had realized that it would be so difficult to fix the cover. There were 5 pieces of metal, and you put these into special holes on the side of the boat. The pieces of metal were half circles, and when you had put them into the holes, you just had to pull the cover over them. We thought it would probably take about 10 minutes. We were wrong. We took the pieces of metal, and we began to drop them into their holes. You would not expect this to be dangerous work, but it was. First of all, the pieces of metal would not fit into their holes. We had to jump on them, and kick them, and beat them. And when we got one in, we found that it was the wrong piece of metal for those holes, so we had to take it out again. At last we got them finished. Then we only had to put the cover on. George took one end, and he fastened it over the front of the boat. Harris stood in the middle of the boat to take the cover from George. I stayed at the back of the boat to take the end of the cover from Harris. George did his job all right, but it was new work to Harris, and he did everything wrong. I do not know how he did it, and Harris himself could not explain it later. After 10 minutes of really hard work, he was inside the cover. He could not get out. He fought the cover hard and knocked George over. Then George got angry and he began to fight too. George could not get out of the cover either. At the time, I did not know anything about all this. I did not understand what was happening anyway. They had told Montmorency and me to stand and wait. So Montmorency and I stood there and waited. We could see that the cover was moving about quite violently. However, we thought that it was all necessary for the job. We did nothing because they had told us to wait. We also heard many bad words coming from under the cover. Montmorency and I decided that this was because the job was very difficult. We waited for some time, but everything seemed to get worse. Finally, George's head appeared over the side of the boat. It said, "We can't breathe under here. Why don't you help us, you great stupid thing?" So I went and helped them. Harris's face was nearly black, so I was just in time. It took another half an hour after that to fix the cover. And then we started to prepare supper. We needed some hot water to make tea. So we put the water on the stove at the front of the boat, and we went to the back. We pretended that we were not interested in the water at all. We wanted it to think that we did not care if it got hot or not. We began to get the other things out. That is the only way to get hot water on the river. If the water knows that you are waiting for it, it will never get hot. You have to go away and begin your meal without it. You must not look at it. Then you will soon hear it making a lot of noise because it wants to be made into tea. It is also a good idea to talk very loudly to each other. You must say that you do not want any tea, that you do not need any tea, and that you are not going to have any tea. You get very near the water, and you shout, "I don't want any tea, do you, George?" And George shouts back, "Oh no, I don't like tea, we'll have milk." This makes the water very angry, and it gets hot very fast. We did this, and when everything else was ready, the tea was ready too. Then we sat down to have supper. We really wanted that supper. We needed that supper. And for 35 minutes, nobody on the boat spoke. After supper, we sat and smiled at each other. We smiled at Montmorency too. We loved everybody. We sat back, we lit our pipes, and we began to talk. George told us about something very funny that happened to his father once. When he was young, George's father was travelling with a friend. One night, they stopped at a little hotel. They spent the evening there with some other young men. After a very happy evening, they went to bed. It was late, and by that time they, George's father and George's father's friend, were feeling quite happy themselves. Anyway, they were going to sleep in the same room, but in different beds. When they got into the room, they dropped their light, which went out. So they had to undress and get into bed in the dark. They thought they were getting into separate beds. However, because they could not see, they both got into the same one. One of them got in with his head at the top of the bed. The other one got in on the other side of the bed. He lay with his feet by the first one's head. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then George's father said, "Joe?" "What's the matter, Tom?" Joe replied from the other end of the bed. "Why, there's a man in my bed," George's father said. "His feet are here, next to me." "Well, that's very strange, Tom," Joe answered, "but there's a man in my bed too." "What are you going to do?" George's father asked. "Well, I'm going to throw him out," Joe replied. "So am I," George's father said bravely. There was a short fight, and then there were 2 heavy bangs on the floor. After a moment or two, a rather sad voice said, "I say, Tom." "Yes?" "How have you got on?" "Well, to tell the truth, my man's thrown me out." "My man's thrown me out too. I say, this isn't a very good hotel, is it?" At the end of George's story, Harris asked, "What was the name of the hotel?" "The Riverside," George replied. "Why?" "Ah, it isn't the same hotel then," Harris answered. "What do you mean?" George asked. "Well, it's strange," Harris said, "but the same thing happened to my father once. I've often heard him tell the story." After that, we went to bed. But I slept very badly.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed our content, don't forget to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next video.